Asian American Studies means a lot to me. And it's a way for us to have a more complete picture.
Our struggles, our triumphs, our tears, our mournings, they're all interconnected. And nothing exists in a vacuum.
I was learning so much about white history and like American history, but then I was like always thinking about like where do I fit into the equation.
Asian Americans have been in the United States for hundreds of years. And today, they're the fastest growing demographic in the country. But historically, they've been marginalized and even erased from popular American history and culture. But that's beginning to change at the movies, at the polls, and on university campuses. After decades of student activism, Asian American Studies programs are finally gaining a foothold at colleges in once resistant regions. And yet, that progress comes amidst an onslaught of continuing violence incited by anti-Asian rhetoric at the beginning of the pandemic. I'm Anissa Khalifa, and this week on The Broadside, the history of Asian American Studies and why it's finally having a moment in the South. That's Professor Nayoung Aimee Kwon of Duke University. She's the founding director of Duke's Asian American and Diaspora Studies program. She was also my thesis advisor when I was a grad student. So you could say I'm kind of close to this story.
How many years has it been?
It's been almost 3 years.
Wow.
I recently went to see Professor Kwon at Duke to ask her about the history of the movement for Asian American Studies, or AAS, and find out where it stands today.
Right now, with Duke and elsewhere in the American South, there's actually a new wave that started really in the last few years, in which we're establishing for the very first time these programs. So it's a little bit belated.
And by a little belated, she means by about 50 years.
The history of ethnic studies in the United States goes back a long ways. To the 1960s, when the Civil Rights Movement and the anti-war movement against the American war in Vietnam were concurrently happening. And many students across our campuses were mobilizing, particularly to learn the history of the United States that is more inclusive of a wider swath of Americans who have been here for 100 years and have not been included in these histories.
Brother Malcolm, want to Mecca.
Let's travel back in time to 1968 on the campus of San Francisco State University. That's where a multi-ethnic coalition of student groups formed the Third World Liberation Front and demanded that the school teach the histories of people of color. They called for African American, Chicano, Native American, and Asian American studies. Community radio station KPFA was on the ground during many of the protests. Their movement carried the spirit of student uprisings that were happening around the world against colonialism, capitalism, and war. Led by the Black Student Union, the group shut down classes and gathered support from faculty, labor unions, and community groups in San Francisco.
The demands of the black students and the Third World Liberation Front are not discussable, negotiable, debatable, or compromisable.
In 1969, the protests spread to nearby UC Berkeley. In response, then-Governor Ronald Reagan declared a state of emergency. The California National Guard descended on Berkeley with tear gas and shotguns.
Now they're very strongly kicking students, and they're beating them over the head with their clubs.
After 5 months of protests, the two schools finally agreed to the students' demands. To this day, it remains the longest on-campus strike in American history.
So that is the beginning of ethnic studies and Asian American studies.
That's Professor Kwon again.
Asian American students worked hand in hand, side to side with Black students, Latinx students, Native American students, and so forth. So it was a multi-ethnic coalition that really try to revolutionize the way we teach our histories, our literatures, our other cultural experiences at our universities.
But despite those early successes, the movement largely petered out.
For the most part, most universities in the United States today do not have Asian American Studies programs. While there was a regional movement, a national movement that started in the California schools, each school, each institution really was left to itself to fight these battles again and again and again.
So, what were the stumbling blocks? Professor Kwon says most advocates for AAS fell victim to academic bureaucracy. Universities move slowly.
And so if you think about the makeup of a department, the faculty in a university, we're hired to teach certain classes. We're hired to do certain jobs, mentor students, do administrative roles, and so forth. Program building is something that you have to do on the side, on top of everything else that you are already hired to do.
Of course, there have been notable exceptions. In 1995, students at Northwestern University successfully lobbied for the establishment of an AAS program, inspiring a wave of protests across the Midwest and Northeast. But the catalyst for that victory was a 23-day hunger strike.
Charles Chun is not a revolutionary. Charles Chun is not a rabble-rouser. Charles Chun is a student.
AAS programs have also faced regional challenges.
Well, in the South, I think it's more evident than the rest of the country, is that race is defined by black and white.
Professor Esther Kim Lee is the current director of Duke's Asian American and Diaspora Studies program, Professor Kwon's successor. She says that while Asian American communities have a long history in the South, they don't usually get included in the cultural conversation of being Southern.
So where and when does Asian American studies enter in that dialogue? And how does it complicate that binary of black and white? So that's one challenge, is to question what race means.
In the New South, people are challenging that binary way of thinking.
We are seeing a huge population change and growth in major cities like Atlanta or Raleigh, Durham, where we have just people moving in who are Asian American, and we're still trying to figure out how that's changing the region.
Asian Americans are the fastest growing demographic in the United States. According to the U.S. Census, the population grew by 36% in the last decade. In the Southeast, that number is even higher, 46%. This corresponds with an expansion of AAS programs at universities throughout the region. In 2020, UNC Chapel Hill opened an Asian American Center on its campus. Students are now petitioning for a program. Duke approved a minor in Asian American Studies last year, and this past spring, Vanderbilt University launched both a major and a minor. But demographics aren't always destiny. For Esther Kim Lee and the Duke community, even after getting a program established, students and faculty face challenges and broken promises.
2018, when the program was founded, many students and faculty were frustrated that the administration would promise certain things, like say, we will have a program or we will have new faculty hire, but none of those things actually happened. So why that's the case? There are a number of reasons. It's that you could think of administrators thinking that there's no value in the field, in value in including Asian American studies. That's one. I've also heard them worrying that there may be a few number of activist students asking for it, but if you actually offer the courses, no one is going to take it, which turned out to be not true. I've heard that as well. So there may be some perception of the student activism as something that they could just brush aside. And if you wait 4 years, they'll graduate and, it'll be quiet again. I think not to be too cynical about it, but I think that's been the attitude.
I'm Anita Rao, host of the weekly podcast Embodied. It's a show that no matter the topic dives into unexpected territory, like what it's like to first get an autism diagnosis as an adult, or how BDSM communities may change the way you think about kink. You'll meet folks who aren't afraid to question what we think we know about intimacy and who have some fascinating stories to share about their relationships. Listen to Embodied and let's take on the taboo together.
Police have arrested a suspect in an anti-Asian attack in New York.
Crimes against Asian Americans surged by nearly 150%.
A brutal attack on a college student is causing fear and outrage.
Number of hate crimes in over a decade. For Asian Americans, the attacks came with the pandemic and the rhetoric from
the scapegoating of ethnic minorities during times of crisis is not a new phenomenon. As I reported this story over the last few months, the waves of anti-Asian violence that have been brutalizing the community were never far from my mind. And the people I interviewed all shared mixed feelings about seeing so much progress for Asian American studies programs during a time of so much fear and grief. None more so than Iris Kim. She started a campaign for AAS at Vanderbilt University in Nashville during the spring of 2021, when she was a senior.
It was a pandemic. Anti-Asian sentiment was rising. And so there was this very much like short-term result that we wanted to address, which was to address the students who do not feel safe right now. Like actually, doing more than just sending out an email acknowledging that these incidents are happening or like that these hate crimes are happening. I thought about my brother who was applying to school at the time, and I could not really get myself to recommend Vanderbilt for him to apply for college because I just felt like finding community and feeling like you belong here, especially as an Asian American student, and then even more specific for him as an Asian American guy, that it was really tough to just like find community. So it was like a variety of those factors as a student that made me want to start this call.
Iris was in the early stages of gathering support, and then tragedy struck.
We released a statement on Monday, started gathering signatures, had hundreds, and then on Wednesday was when the Atlanta shootings happened.
Iris is referring to the shocking murders of 8 people on March 16th, 2021, when a man went on a shooting spree at 3 spas in the Atlanta metro area. 6 of his victims were Asian women, and the tragedy is widely believed to be racially motivated.
And this was something very close to Nashville. It was an event that really shocked a lot of people in our community. And it was really a bittersweet turning point because until then we were gathering support, but on Wednesday was like when an emergency council was put together and then things actually happened.
How do you feel about the fact that it took the momentum caused by this horrific tragedy to really make things happen the way that you were trying to get them to happen?
It wasn't a good feeling. I think in the first week, that was actually a fear I had that people would assume, or people who didn't know what came first would assume we started this call after the shootings happened, but we've been here this whole time. And maybe it's getting more attention now because of the event, but it was a confusing time. It was not joyful or celebratory for a long time, I think, because we had to recognize that there was a lot of pain there.
Since I spoke to Iris last fall, Vanderbilt approved both a minor and a major in Asian American Studies. The new curriculum started this spring. That's stunningly fast progress for any student movement. Iris gives credit to a nationwide wave of student activism and cooperation between groups at different colleges, comparing notes and sharing resources.
This is the first time that Asian American student leaders have gathered from so many different schools like having Zoom meetings and talking about the changes they want to see in their universities and how we can do it as unified, in a unified way.
For advocates of AAS in the South, there's a lot to celebrate in this moment. Last fall, I attended the first ever Southeast Conference for Asian American Studies. It brought together faculty, students, and alumni from more than 15 universities. The energy in the room was palpable, as attendees told an oral history of the movement and grappled with how to extend their successes to more Southern schools. Members of the Asian American Studies Working Group were there too.
I think we met at the conference, right? Yeah.
Well, it's wonderful meeting you again.
The group is lovingly referred to as ASWAG. It's a grassroots student organization that has led the movement for AAS at Duke for 20 years. Earlier this year, I caught up with some members of ASWAG at their space in the Student Center.
Can we go inside, or would we be disturbing?
We can go inside.
The building stands in the literal shadow of Duke's chapel, framed in the same Gothic style and iconic varicolored stone. It smelled nostalgic, and a little like mildew. I asked the students why it's so important to have an official minor, when courses covering Asian American culture and history already existed. Here's David Lee, one of the first students to take the minor at Duke.
I think the most obvious is that it just gives some form of academic validation. Obviously, taking classes because you want to is a great thing about college, but anyone who's been in the college system knows that's not realistic for the most part. Another thing is that it just gives a cohesive way for you to find these classes, because especially in when I came in 2019, it was really word of mouth. If you could figure out this class, this professor is really cool, you should take that class. But because there is no course code, or there is no way to find it outside of people being nice and letting you know, there was accessibility was one of those issues.
Student and faculty efforts to make Asian American studies happen at Duke have paid off. The program has been able to establish a minor and hire 2 tenure-track faculty, but they still don't have a major, or the permanence that would come from being an actual department. And the future isn't guaranteed. In my reporting, both faculty and students expressed worry it could disappear. On the other side of campus, Professor Kwon, the founding director of Duke's program, told me that she shares those concerns about sustainability.
My worry is that when the crisis ends, when energy runs out, when the students stop advocating, because they're really doing so much, right? They're doing their schoolwork, they're working towards their career aspirations, they are figuring out their lives as growing adults and individuals, and they're advocating for program building. So when that energy necessarily dissipates, when a crisis takes attention away from some of these issues and concerns, I'm afraid that the resources will also run dry.
And while she fears for the future of AAS programs, Professor Kwon also told me something surprising. She wishes we didn't need them at all.
I mean, if you look around, America is a very diverse country, right? But the average American may not understand why there are these different communities that have been here for hundreds of years, and how these communities are either segregated from each other or entangled in their various ways. And so Asian American Studies, African American Studies, we're really trying to add to a narrative that has actively excluded these histories in our curriculum, in our narratives. And so my hope is that eventually we will come to a point where we won't need something like Asian American Studies or African American Studies as a separate standalone program to make up for the absences that are in programs like history or English or political science or sociology.
But right now we need it.
Yeah, right now we need it.
Thank you to everyone who spoke to me for this story, including Professor Ben Tran and students Tang Lian and Angela Yan, whose voices you heard at the top of the episode. Archival audio comes from KPFA Community Radio, California Newsreel's documentary San Francisco State on Strike, and Originating Moments Envisioning Futures from Northwestern University's Asian American Studies program. This episode was produced by me, Anissa Khalifa. Our editor is Jared Walker. Sean Rue provided audio engineering support. The Broadside is a production of North Carolina Public Radio, WUNC. We live on your favorite podcast app and on WUNC.org. If you enjoyed the show, leave us a rating, a review, or tell a friend to tell a friend. Thanks for listening, and we'll be back next week.